Welcome to Midnight Pages, a quiet place where timeless literature gently leads you into rest at the close of your day. Tonight, we invite you into the delicate and haunting world of The Painted Veil, a deeply introspective novel by Somerset Maugham. Set in the sweltering heat and mist of a colonial outpost in the East, this is the story of betrayal, forgiveness, and quiet transformation. Of a woman who, through sorrow and solitude, begins to see herself and the world anew. The Painted Veil is not merely a tale of infidelity or loss. It is a meditation on inner awakening, a portrait of what it means to face one's mistakes and emerge changed, not with grand redemption, but with fragile, hard-earned wisdom. Now, turn off the lights. Find a calm and comfortable space, and let Midnight Pages carry you to a distant place where the veil of illusion slowly lifts and something honest begins to shine through. Part 1. The air in Hong Kong was heavy that night, thick with heat, thicker still with secrets. Somewhere deep within the colonial district, behind ivy-covered walls and shuttered windows, two lovers moved in silence, breathless, reckless, desperate. Kitty Fane had never imagined herself capable of such deception, but here she was, tangled in the arms of Charlie Townsend, his breath on her neck, their shadows merging against the candle-lit walls. She laughed softly, but it was a nervous sound, fragile, uncertain.
"Do you ever think we'll be caught?"
she asked. Charlie smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her face.
"Let them try. I'd give up everything for you."
But he didn't mean it. Not in the way she needed him to. Not in the way the sound of footsteps outside the door now made her blood freeze. The door opened. Slowly, deliberately. Dr. Walter Fane stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes focused not on Charlie, not even on Kitty, but on the truth that hung in the air, undeniable and bitter. No one spoke. The silence screamed louder than words. Later, in the stillness of their home, Kitty faced Walter. Her dress was different, her hair pinned back, but nothing could change what he had seen. Walter sat quietly, the weight of betrayal resting heavily on his shoulders. Finally, he broke the silence.
"I spoke to Charlie,"
he said.
"I gave him a chance to prove his devotion to you, to make things right."
Her breath caught.
"And?"
"He refused. He won't leave his wife or his children."
Kitty's throat burned with shame and humiliation. The man she had risked everything for had already turned away. Walter's voice dropped, softer now, but no less sharp.
"You may think I'm a fool, but when I asked you to marry me, I already knew who you were. I knew you were proud, vain, careless with others' hearts. But I loved you anyway."
Kitty looked down.
"Then why are you punishing me?"
Walter stood and walked slowly to the window. The light caught the tired lines on his face.
"Because this isn't punishment. This is clarity. You must choose, Kitty. Come with me to Manfu. There's a cholera epidemic. I've been assigned there. Or I'll agree to a divorce, if Charlie agrees to marry you."
Her voice cracked.
"You drag me to a place filled with death?"
Walter turned. His eyes were calm, empty.
"No, I'd take you somewhere truth still matters. You can choose, Kitty, but don't pretend you don't already know what Charlie's answer will be."
She had no answer, only silence. Over the next few days, she sent desperate letters to Charlie, pleading, hoping. His replies came back cold, careful, calculated. The words of a man protecting his own comfort, not a man willing to risk anything for her. In the end, she had no choice at all. Kitty boarded the riverboat beside Walter. The air was thick with humidity and dread. They traveled inland, past withered rice fields and quiet villages, deeper into a land held hostage by disease. Walter remained silent, a ghost of the man he once was. Kitty sat beside him, wrapped in regret. When they arrived at Manfu, the town looked like a place abandoned by hope. Smoke rose from distant fires. The convent where they would stay was surrounded by silence and sorrow. Walter threw himself into the work. Hours passed as he treated the sick, his hands moving with care and skill. For the first time, Kitty saw him, not as the reserved man she married out of convenience, but as someone noble, even heroic. She watched from a distance, unsure of what she felt. Not love, not yet, but something else, a seed of recognition. And as days slipped by, something inside her shifted. The veil of ignorance and selfishness, her veil, began to thin, and in its place, a trembling thread of understanding began to form. Part 2. The convent at Manfu stood solemn against the rising sun, a cluster of stone and silence perched on the edge of despair. Every morning, the town awoke to the tolling bell, its sound both warning and prayer. Kitty Fane, once the centerpiece of lavish tea parties and whispered admiration, now woke to the sobs of dying children and the smell of lye and sweat. She could barely recognize herself. Walter was never in their shared quarters. He worked from dawn to dusk, his hand steady as he moved through rows of cots, his presence more needed here than she had ever known him to be. The cholera epidemic consumed the town, but not his resolve. Kitty began to help the French nuns with their work. At first awkwardly, then with cautious care. She bathed infants whose parents had succumbed to the disease, soothed crying children, folded linens for the sick. Her hands, once manicured and idle, now bore the faint smell of carbolic and rose water. One day, while assisting Sister St. Joseph, Kitty asked,
How do you do this every day? See so much pain and not fall apart?
The nun smiled gently.
Pain is not the end of things, Cher. It is the beginning. You learn to find God in the sorrow.
That night, Kitty sat in the garden beneath a hanging lantern. Fireflies flickered like tiny souls. She opened a letter, one she had written but never sent, to her father. Her hand paused. Then she began a new letter, no longer filled with complaints or regrets, but with questions. Honest ones. The days stretched on. Walter remained distant, his face gaunt, eyes sunken from long nights. But one evening, returning from the clinic, he found Kitty sitting in the chapel alone, her head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. He didn't interrupt. It was the first time he had truly looked at her in weeks. She was thinner, her cheeks sun-kissed and freckled, her posture humbler. Something had changed. And for the first time, Walter did not feel anger toward her. He felt curiosity. Later, they sat beneath a dim lamp, drinking weak tea. It was the first time they spoke in days.
I see you've been helping,
he said. Kitty nodded.
The children needed someone, and I needed to feel human again.
Walter looked down.
I never meant to hurt you. I just didn't know how else to face it.
She met his eyes.
You were right. About Charlie, about me. I didn't know what love was. Maybe I still don't.
There was silence between them, but it was no longer cruel. It was waiting. A week later, a letter arrived from Charlie. Kitty read it in the garden. The words were hollow, filled with feigned concern and polite distance. He hoped she was well. He mentioned nothing of love, nothing of her return. She burned the letter without hesitation. Walter saw the ashes scatter in the wind. He didn't ask. One morning, Kitty joined Walter at the clinic. He handed her gloves and a mask. She followed him into the ward, unsure but willing. The smell of disinfectant, the quiet groans of patients, the constant hum of urgency, it no longer repelled her. It grounded her. That night, she dreamed not of London balls or forbidden trysts, but of quiet hands tending the sick, of eyes meeting across an oil lamp, of redemption whispered in small acts of kindness. Kitty was changing, and Walter saw it. Though neither spoke the words aloud, something was beginning between them, not romance, not yet love, but a shared humanity, a thread of connection stronger than betrayal. The painted veil that once blinded them both was beginning to lift. Part 3. There was a strange peace in the air. Though the threat of cholera loomed over the town like an invisible fog, life, quiet, stubborn life, persisted. And in the midst of that fragile persistence, Kitty found herself changing. Each morning, she walked to the convent. The cries of children, the scent of medicinal herbs, the soft hush of nuns in prayer. It was all becoming familiar, strangely comforting. She had come here as a punishment. But now, in the faces of the orphans and the worn hands of the sisters, she began to sense something else, something like grace. One afternoon, while she was bandaging a boy's scraped knee, the Mother Superior approached silently and placed a gentle hand on Kitty's shoulder.
"Your hands are soft,"
she said.
"You have touched suffering, but you still carry kindness. That is rare."
Kitty looked up, startled. No one had spoken to her like that in a long time, not without judgment, not without bitterness. Something warm stirred within her, like the first crack of sunlight through a long-closed curtain. As the days passed, she found herself smiling more, at the children's clumsy songs, at the way the smallest ones clung to her skirts, at the odd, fierce way life insisted on going on, even in the shadow of death. She did not notice it at first, but the woman she had once been, the frightened, shallow girl who feared loneliness more than dishonor, was slowly slipping away. And then, one evening, Walter returned home later than usual. His face was tired, hollowed by endless hours at the hospital. But there was something else there too, a flicker of light in his eyes, as if something had softened him.
"A child died today,"
he said quietly.
"I don't know his name. I don't know if anyone ever did, but I held his hand while he passed, and for that brief moment, I felt alive."
Kitty didn't speak. Instead, she walked over and sat beside him. No words passed between them, only silence. But in that silence was an understanding deeper than any apology. He was not the man she had thought him to be. Not bitter, not cruel, not just a stranger hiding behind cold dignity. He was a man who carried his sorrow like a cloak, but who still showed up to save others, who still believed in something, even when everything around him was falling apart. And she had hurt him, deeply, irrevocably. A few days later, they went walking together along the edge of a cliff. Below them, the river moved slowly, carrying reflections of orange clouds. The wind tugged gently at her scarf. She turned to him, unsure of her voice.
"Why did you bring me here?"
she asked. He looked away for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible.
"At first, it was revenge. I wanted you to suffer. But then, I think I knew. Somehow, I hoped this place would change you."
The sky was burning with the last fire of the sun. Kitty felt her chest tighten. Her voice trembled.
It did.
She said,
Walter, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. I was blind.
Walter glanced at her, and for the first time in what felt like years, he smiled. Not a large smile, not triumphant, just quiet, accepting.
We all were.
He said. They stood in silence, side by side, looking out over the slow-moving river. And in that moment, Kitty knew. Something inside her, some fragile, long-lost hope, was beginning to breathe again. Not because of forgiveness or guilt or duty, but because love, once dismissed and misunderstood, had returned. Not loudly, not demandingly, just there, in the quiet. Part 4. It began with a dream. Not the kind that slips away with the morning light, but the kind that lingers, haunting, vivid, unsettling. In the dream, Kitty stood in a field of white flowers, their petals withering at her touch. She tried to run, but the earth was soft beneath her feet, as if it meant to swallow her whole. And then, Walter's voice, calling her name, not in anger, not in grief, just as if he were waiting. She woke with a gasp, the room still dark, the air thick with humidity. But something inside her had shifted. She had spent so many years sleepwalking through life, shielded by vanity, distracted by pleasure, numbed by resentment. But now, the veil had lifted, not completely, but enough to see that something within her had begun to stir, something raw, honest, and unbearably human. At the convent that day, she noticed the children differently, not just as poor, faceless beings in need of care, but as small souls, bright and fragile, whose laughter carried defiance against death. She found herself laughing with them, not politely, not guardedly, but freely, with abandon. And when she knelt beside a dying girl whose fever had raged through the night, Kitty held her hand with a steadiness she didn't know she possessed. The girl's eyes fluttered open for a moment, then closed forever, and Kitty did not cry. She only whispered, "You were loved." That evening, as the sun hung low over the hills, Walter came home early. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, the woman she had become, or was becoming. He sat at the small table by the window, where the light touched everything with a golden hush.
You've changed,
he said quietly. Kitty looked down, then back at him.
No,
She answered.
I'm still changing. Every day.
Walter poured tea. They drank in silence, but this silence no longer held resentment or awkwardness. It was full of thoughts, of questions, of something tender taking root. After dinner, Kitty found herself standing alone in the garden. The moon had risen, casting silver shadows on the worn stone path. In the distance, she heard the faint hum of a hymn coming from the convent chapel. It was beautiful, not because of its melody, but because it sounded like a plea and a promise. She closed her eyes. Was this redemption? Was this what it meant to start over, not by erasing the past, but by choosing moment by moment to live differently? She thought of Charlie, of the life she thought she wanted, the lies she told herself to survive. And suddenly, it all felt so small. Walter found her there.
You're out late.
He said.
I couldn't sleep.
Neither can I.
They walked together under the moonlight, not speaking for a long while. Then Kitty stopped.
Walter,
She said, her voice trembling slightly.
why did you marry me?
He didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky as if the truth were written among the stars.
Because I was a fool. Because I thought, if I loved you hard enough, you might love me back.
Kitty stepped closer, the air between them suddenly heavy with everything unsaid.
I never knew how to love,
She whispered.
but I think I want to learn.
Walter looked at her, not with triumph, not with forgiveness, but with something close to hope. And in that still moment, between confession and possibility, between moonlight and shadow, something fragile passed between them. Not a resolution, but a beginning. Part 5. It came without warning. The sickness moved like a shadow, swift, invisible, cruel. One moment Walter was tending to a patient in the ward. The next, he was gripping the edge of the table, pale and breathless, his body betraying him. Kitty stood at his side within moments. The air turned cold around her. Everything else, the walls, the floor, the faces of the nuns, blurred into the background.
No,
She whispered, shaking her head.
not you.
Walter looked up at her, his face calm, too calm. He knew. Even before the fever had come, he had known this day might find him. But Kitty had only just found him again. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. Her hands trembled.
I'm fine.
He said, managing a faint smile.
It's just a fever. Nothing more.
But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. And in her heart, she knew. Hours passed. The fever grew stronger. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness, his skin flushed, his breathing shallow. Kitty never left his side. She held his hand, wiped his face, whispered small, meaningless things, anything to keep him tethered to the world. But he was slipping. In the dim light of dawn, as the first birds began to sing beyond the window, Kitty leaned in close.
Walter,
She whispered.
I need to tell you something. Please, listen.
He opened his eyes, barely. His gaze found hers.
I'm here.
He murmured. Kitty took his hand in both of hers, pressing it to her chest.
I didn't know what love was. I was selfish, lost, afraid. But these months, you...
Her voice broke. She leaned in closer.
You loved me even when I didn't deserve it, and I was too blind to see what I had.
Tears slipped down her cheeks, falling onto his pillow.
I love you, Walter.
She said, clearly, strongly, as if the truth could anchor him to life.
I love you. I love you.
Walter's eyes shimmered. He lifted his hand weakly, brushing her cheek.
Kitty.
He whispered, his voice nearly gone.
That is all I ever wanted to hear.
A pause, a breath, a stillness, and then silence. Kitty froze, the weight of his hand in hers, the sudden quiet, the absence of breath.
No.
She clutched him, her forehead pressed to his, tears streaming freely now.
No, please. Not yet.
But he was gone, and in that moment, something inside her shattered, something she could never reclaim. But something else also bloomed in its place, a quiet, enduring love that no longer demanded or questioned, a love that simply remained. Part 6. Everything was still. After Walter's death, time seemed to suspend itself. His desk, his teacup, the shirt folded neatly on the edge of the bed, they all remained untouched, as though he might return at any moment. Kitty sat in the quiet, not speaking, not moving. The silence around her was complete. And yet, she did not cry. The tears had already come and gone. What remained was deeper, longing, remorse, and the weight of words that had come too late. A few days later, the Mother Superior found her in the corridor.
He went peacefully.
She said softly.
Because of you.
Kitty nodded. Deep in her heart, she knew it was true. She had told him she loved him, and he had heard it. That had been enough. The funeral was quiet, solemn, and strangely beautiful. The villagers came. The nuns stood in silence. The children held white flowers in their small hands. Kitty felt grief, yes, but also something else. Something that felt like reverence. That night, she looked up at the sky, full of stars, and whispered,
Walter, I won't forget what you gave me, ever.
She was alone now, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. A few days later, she boarded a small boat to begin the journey home. The river shimmered as it always had. The wind moved through the reeds like a lullaby. But Kitty was no longer the same woman. When she arrived in London, the city looked different. Familiar streets felt foreign. Her old life, her old self, felt like something she had shed long ago. She had returned, but she had also been reborn. At her mother's house, she stood at the front door and hesitated for a moment. When it opened, her mother gasped, but said nothing. She simply reached out and held her. And in that quiet embrace, Kitty let herself rest. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't regret. It was simply life continuing, one breath at a time. A few days later, she walked through a small garden behind the house, and suddenly, she felt it. A flutter, small, software alive. She pressed her hand gently to her belly, Walter's child. Her eyes welled with tears. But this time, they weren't only tears of grief. She smiled.
We'll be all right.
She whispered.
I'll take care of you.
And from that day on, she lived. Not perfectly, not without sorrow, but with purpose. She would remember, she would grow. And one day, when the time was right, she would tell her child the truth. That his father was a quiet man, but a man who loved deeply. A man whose love had saved her, and whose death had made her whole again. Closing the painted veil for Midnight Pages. Thank you for joining us tonight on Midnight Pages. As we close the final chapter of the painted veil, we are left not with resolution, but with reflection. What does it mean to love, truly, deeply, without condition? What becomes of us when pride hardens the heart and regret arrives too late? And in the stillness that follows loss, what part of ourselves is finally revealed? Somerset Maugham's quiet masterpiece is not a story of grand gestures. It is a story of small awakenings, of pain that teaches, and of a woman who learns, slowly and painfully, how to live and how to love. Kitty began her journey afraid of silence, of shame, of facing herself. But by the end, she discovered something rare, that strength can come from sorrow, that forgiveness can take root in broken ground, and that love, once dismissed as foolish, can become the very thing that saves us. Walter's death was not the end. It was the veil lifting, revealing truth, humility, and a second chance at life. As we drift into sleep tonight, may this story remind us that healing is not loud. It is quiet. It happens when no one is watching, and often it begins when we stop running from ourselves. So take a slow breath, feel the softness of the night, and remember, in the space between grief and grace, we can be reborn. Good night, and thank you for being with us here on Midnight Pages, where stories linger long after the final word is spoken.